All right, so chapter 24 is all about World War II. Chapter 23, we left off talking about the New Deal and how the New Deal was an attempt to um, at least minimize the biggest, most significant impacts of the Great Depression, or maybe even hopefully end the Great Depression. But what we will find is in the end, the New Deal was monumentally successful at allowing us to survive the Great Depression. What will finally actually end the Great Depression is World War II. In the same way as we saw during World War One, a massive buildup and increase in our industrial production that's going to lead to a spike in our the industrial production will lead to kind of a spike or an advancement, a growth of our economic success and health. We will also see that with World War II. And so that level of production that's going to be necessary to help win a war is going to be the thing that pulls us out of the Great Depression finally and will put us on a trajectory for a post World War II economy that's going to be very strong. But more on that later on. Um, a word of warning at the beginning for those of you who are military lovers. By and large, the APUSH curriculum doesn't really cover too much of the actual military aspects of the war. It is assumed that you learned all about the nitty gritty details of the war and what caused the war and all of the different strategies and battles of the war during your sophomore year. More so, this focuses on kind of how we got into the war, how the war impacted us on the home front, a little bit about the overall strategies, but it will be brief and kind of general when we get into the actual fighting of the war. So if you were hoping for the kind of History Channel documentary level detail about World War II, where we get into weapons advancement and things like that, that's not going to be here. So just a heads up on that one. All right. So World War II, the World at War, 1937 and 1945. Part one, the road to war. So what we're going to see here is, by and large, a rerun of what we saw in the lead up to World War One. We're going to see a war between European nations, which will expand beyond Europe into other parts of the world, that we will want nothing to do with. We're going to have no interest whatsoever in getting involved in this thing, just like with World War One. At the beginning of World War One, when World War One broke out, we were kind of watching from afar across the Atlantic, saying, "No, not interested in getting involved in that. We're going to just stay over here and do our thing." But as you may recall, slowly but surely we got dragged into World War One because even though we claimed neutrality, we ended up obviously taking one side over the other, loaning money, doing more trade with one side over the other, and that was the side of Britain and France instead of Germany. And eventually, American ships and British ships with Americans on there kept getting bombed or kept getting attacked by German U-boats, which kind of was led to a tipping point, which is going to lead us to the war. And then finally, the Zimmerman Note was kind of the final straw that broke the camel's back, and that dragged us into World War One. And us getting involved in World War One really kind of was the tipping point then in World War One, allowing our side to win. Everything I just said, by and large, is going to be similar to what we're going to see right here with World War II. So when World War II breaks out in the 1930s, we are in the midst of the Great Depression. We are in the middle of trying to figure out how to survive this economic calamity. We had made it through the first New Deal, the second New Deal is in full swing. We're trying to get people back to work. We're trying to keep people in their homes. We're trying to stabilize our economy in a variety of ways. And now that Europe has kind of once again descended into war, we once again are saying we have no interest in getting involved in that. That is just not our thing. We're not doing it. No way, no how. Not going to happen. So a couple of neutrality acts are going to be passed in 1935 and 1936, and these neutrality acts specifically speak to or are focused on the things that got us involved in World War One. Right? This wasn't all that long ago that we found ourselves in the same position, and we can remember, okay, what was it that ended up dragging us into World War One? Let's make sure we don't do that again. So some of the things in the Neutrality Acts of 1935 and 1936 are that no Americans are allowed on any ships that from countries that are involved in the war. So none of the belligerent ships. We're not going to sell or transport any munitions to any of the countries involved in the war. We're not going to make any loans to any countries involved in the war. Because you remember, even when we said we were neutral at first in World War I, we started making loans. We started selling them, munitions, guns, bombs, such and such and such. And Americans were killed during those kind of submarine attacks. And so we're like, all of that is what dragged us into World War One. So we are 100% not going to do that. So you can see we took a very isolationist view. We metaphorically built a wall around our entire nation to say, nope, not getting involved, stay out. This is what we're doing. But you can see there was some level of criticism. Here we have a cartoon from Dr. Seuss, who was a political cartoonist before he was a kids book author, and you can see all of those trees in our various European countries, and that bird is pecking away at those trees with a swastika on it, obviously representing the Nazis. And we think we're over here totally content, peaceful. We're going to stay out of it. We're not going to get involved. But the implication of this cartoon here is, of course, it's eventually going to come to us. If we don't get involved, that bird will come to us and start pecking away as well. So better to get involved now than wait for it to gather strength, right? And then the alternative view is seen on the political cartoon on the right, right? And so you see Uncle Sam gazing across the Atlantic at Europe, which is very clearly up in flames. And Lady Liberty, or Lady Democracy, I guess you could say, is saying, "Stay out for my sake as well as your own." Like we are the last refuge for democracy, and the best way for us to defend democracy is to just stay out of it and stay isolationist. So you can see there are various views on this, but the official policy of the United States when the war breaks out is neutrality. And just as a quick reminder, in case you forgot, the basic cause of the war is that Germany is blatantly disregarding many of the things that post World War I peace treaties demanded that they do. It demanded that they, dramatically decrease basically to demilitarize. And there's a whole bunch of other things they were required to do, basically kind of as a punishment for World War I, kind of being one of the instigators, but also to make sure that they can't instigate another war. So they start blatantly disregarding those things. And for a long time, most of the other European countries, afraid of getting into another war, kind of ignored that Germany was blatantly disregarding those things. And then by doing so, allowed the Nazi Party, allowed Adolf Hitler, and allowed Germany to kind of grow in strength. So that by the time the rest of Europe decided they needed to deal with Hitler and to deal with the Nazis and to deal with Germany, it was kind of too late, and they had already gathered the strength and they were off and running. So all that was happening. While all that was happening, we were like, not for us. We're not going to do it. We're going to stay neutral. But the more aggressive Hitler and the Nazis in Germany become, it's going to be more and more difficult for us to stay neutral. So case in point, in 1939, Hitler invades Poland. So up until this point, Europe had kind of appeased Hitler, kind of said, let's just give him what he wants, and hopefully, he won't cause another war, right? Which is the exact wrong strategy, right? It's kind of like, dealing with a toddler and say, let's just give him what he wants so he doesn't act like a maniac. And if you give a toddler everything they want, they're going to think they get what they want all the time. So they're going to keep acting like a maniac. So Hitler is like an evil toddler, I guess is what I'm saying here. But the point is, he invades Poland, and this was kind of shocking to a lot of people in Europe and a lot of people around the world, because it was a very clear show of aggression that everybody had been hoping to avoid if we had just kind of ignore him, or if we just give him this piece of land over here and help him, whatever, save face and give some pride to Germany after their huge loss in World War I. But what people didn't realize is that Hitler very clearly had much larger plans that were not going to be satisfied through simple appeasement. So when he invades Poland in 1939, that is kind of a big turning point and a moment of awakening for a lot of people. And so the United States is going to update their Neutrality Act. So they're going to create a new Neutrality Act of 1939 where they're saying we're still officially neutral. We're still officially neutral. But they do create something called a cash and carry program. They say we do need to help out those who are fighting against this guy who's being aggressive. So the cash carry program is going to allow other countries to buy arms from the United States, but they have to come pick them up themselves and they have to pay us for them up front. We're not going to loan them out. So in some ways we're already starting to like step back into the territory we did before, where we were like, okay, we're not gonna get involved, we're not gonna sell any guns or bombs or munitions or arms to anybody. And then Hitler invades Poland. We're like, okay, we will sell you guns and bombs and munitions, but we're not gonna send our own people over there, we're not gonna send our own boats over there. You have to come pick them up and you have to pay for them in advance. So we're kind of starting to compromise our initial position, but not fully get involved in the war quite yet. So cash and carry is a way for us to still claim that we're neutral, but get involved a little bit more. At this point, just kind of from a public support perspective, 84% of Americans support England and France over Germany, which is not that surprising of a revelation. But Hitler's just going to keep on Hitlering, and now he's going to invade France. And again, this is going to be kind of a big shocker for a lot of people, and yet another moment of realization of, oh, this guy's really kind of going for it. Like, this guy's kind of nuts, right? And so quietly, the government, as quietly as you can, being the government, is going to authorize $37 billion to mobilize the military, thinking, okay, we should probably better to be ready than not. And they're going to pass a conscription law, which is basically a draft, right, to start drafting people into the military. So again, you can start to see, officially we're still neutral, officially we haven't declared war on anybody, officially we're not getting involved, but we are kind of, going with a better to be prepared if something happens than not, and beginning to mobilize in some capacity. And there's more on mobilization later, but again, this is kind of the tiptoeing, stepping, or getting dragged in, whatever, however way you want to kind of visualize it, getting dragged into the war. As Hitler gets more aggressive, it's more and more difficult for us to kind of just stay on our side of the ocean and pretend that we're going to be neutral. Then Hitler attacks Britain. And this is going to be a huge, another huge moment for us. The attack on Britain is going to be different. So up until this point, Hitler has, and the Nazis in Germany have been able to do these land attacks on countries that border Germany, right? Going into Poland, going into France, and various other countries as well. The attack on Britain is going to be more complicated and different, of course, because Britain's an island, and that's the best thing they have going for them. So you can't just roll a bunch of tanks across the water into Britain. So this is going to be an aerial attack, and that kind of natural moat, I guess, is the way you could think about it, is a huge benefit in defense for Great Britain. Although they do definitely suffer their share of how do you want to say it, destruction as a result of aerial bombings and things like that. But the attack on Britain is going to be yet again another huge step forward, because by the time we get to 1940, many people kind of see Britain as kind of the last holdout, right? So most of the rest of Europe has either been invaded and now occupied by Germany, or people who have kind of just declared neutrality and said, well, we're not going to get involved, right? We're just going to kind of stay out of it. And so most of mainland Europe has kind of fallen under German control, and really kind of the last holdout is Great Britain. So not only is Great Britain one of our biggest and strongest allies, but if Great Britain falls, that's a huge domino piece to fall, because it's really kind of the last piece of Europe. Kind of, we'll get to that later on. So now we're going to have to update our approach to this thing again. So we're going to move away from the cash and carry, which was the last kind of official policy we had, and we're going to move into lend lease, because Great Britain's going to be like, yo, we can't we can't send boats over to come pick up stuff from you guys. Like, we need everything we can to defend ourselves here. We need you guys to like bring that stuff over here, and we don't really have the funds to pay for it right now. So like, you got to just like give us the stuff and we'll figure it out later on economically. So we passed the Lend Lease bill, which basically says, okay, we're still not technically in the war. We're not declaring war. We're not sending troops over, but we will give money, and we will give munitions, and we will give arms to our allies, right? And so you can see on that image on the right, there's a lot of money given to a lot of different places, but the vast majority of it is going to go to the United Kingdom. Ignore that USSR part because that's kind of more of a post-war situation, but well, never mind. Forget what I just said. I was confusing it with something during the Cold War, so just ignore the last 14 seconds. Anyway, so you can see a vast majority of that fund is going to go to the United Kingdom. A lot of it's going to go to the USSR. And then we'll see other parts of the globe as well. But the point being, it's yet another shift. And this shift is going to draw us further into the war. So this is what I'm saying. This is basically a rerun of World War I. We said we're not going to get involved. And as the war goes on, step by step, we kind of tiptoe closer and closer to actually being involved in the war. Then Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. And this is, you cannot overstate how monumentally stupid of a move this is by Hitler. So we give Hitler a lot of credit for being evil, right? He's kind of our general standard of evil. Like we always compare people, oh, you're as evil as Hitler and whatever, right? That's kind of our most kind of, but I don't think we give Hitler enough credit for how stupid he was, because this was a monumentally stupid thing to do. So just to make sure we understand, earlier on in the war, Germany and the Soviet Union, or Russia, or whoever, whatever you want to call them at the time, entered into basically a neutrality pact. Like, yo, like I'm not going to invade you, you don't invade me, da 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 da, right? And that was a huge benefit for the Germans, because they didn't have to worry about this monumental beast of a country. And they could kind of just do their thing, taking over the rest of Europe and not worry about the Soviet Union and all that other stuff. Then he decides to attack the Soviet Union, which is, again, basically just poking the eye of a bear. Like, it's a terrible idea. Invading the Soviet Union is a monumentally difficult thing to do, especially in the wintertime. And it's muddy, it's cold, and they have an endless number of people that it seems like they don't actually really care that much about. So they could just throw bodies and bodies and bodies and bodies at this thing. So Hitler's this decision to attack the USSR is going to be one of the huge turning points in the war, because it's going to completely change his entire approach. Now, at this point, he feels like, okay, I've taken over all of Europe except for Great Britain. I'm doing that. I'm bombing them. I'm going to roll tanks into the USSR. And the United States hasn't gotten involved yet, so he's not really terribly worried about it. But at this point, the United States and Great Britain say, we need to really make sure we're on the same page here. This is obviously a huge threat. And they come up with something called the Atlantic Charter, in which the United States and the United Kingdom commit to a world of self-determination. Now, this is not technically the United States saying we're going to get involved in the war, but it is in some ways officially the United States saying we will do everything we possibly can, short of sending troops in, to support you in any way we can in this fight against the Soviet Union. Now, for those of you who are a little fuzzy on European history, Great Britain is all the way in the far northwestern part of Europe, an island off of the mainland, and the Soviet Union is all the way in the far eastern part of Europe. So now Hitler is kind of stretched all the way across Europe from the east to the west, and still aggressively attacking Great Britain, so much so that they had to send children and families out of London, which was getting perpetually bombed. Some of those kids even ended up getting lost in a wardrobe and finding a lion and a witch and all kinds of other stuff. But that's going on in Great Britain. So to a certain degree, the Nazis have kind of overextended themselves. And as long as the United States doesn't get involved in the war, that's not really too much of an issue. But fundamentally, the idea to attack the Soviet Union is ultimately going to be the downfall of Hitler, as we'll see. So we see yet again the same thing we saw happen in World War I, very specifically, in which German U-boats, submarines, are going to start to attack American boats, which are sending more and more and more munitions and all of the other things that Great Britain might need, resupplying Great Britain to help them fight the war. We're going to see a lot of American boats be attacked. And as we well know, Americans do not like when their boats are being attacked. Nearly every single American war starts because someone attacks our boats, and we just do not like when people attack our boats. So the sense of neutrality and the sense of wanting to stay out of war is becoming less and less of a priority for the American public. There's a growing frustration with what's going on in Europe, especially now that American boats are being attacked. And of course, there are some people who say, well, we shouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. We shouldn't send those things over there. We should have stayed isolated. But more and more so, people are saying, okay, these Germans are really being a bunch of jerk faces. Maybe we do need to do something about this. And so, as the entire country's attention is kind of focused on the Atlantic and focused on what's going on over there, one of the things that we're not paying as much attention to as a nation is the Pacific. So I will remind you again that the Axis, which is on one side is the Allies, that's the side that America will join, basically like England and the Soviet Union and the United States, although we have not officially joined yet, we will. And the other side is the Axis, that's Germany, Italy, and Japan. And there's more to it than that, but that's basically it. So Japan is allies with Germany, and the United States and Japan have been kind of, we're not paying as much attention to it right now, but the United States government has been paying attention to what's been going on over in the Pacific theater, in which Japan has been aggressively taking over a whole bunch of the islands in the Pacific. And so we've attempted to try to punish them for that, not militarily, but kind of by freezing Japanese accounts at American banks and putting sanctions, meaning we're not going to do trade or anything like that with Japan. So we're kind of trying to slap Japan's hand a little bit and be like, no, you guys are breaking the rules. Stop doing that. You guys are being too aggressive. But by and large, people are not really focused on the Pacific. We're more focused on the Atlantic, what's going on with Germany. But then in the Pacific, Japan realizes, okay, it's probably only a matter of time before the United States gets involved in this thing. The relationship between the United States and Japan is getting more and more contentious as the war wages on. Obviously, the relationship between the United States and Germany is getting more and more contentious, and Germany and Japan are allies. So Japan makes the decision to attack the United States, to preemptively attack the United States. And that attack comes at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, which still President Franklin D. Roosevelt will call a day that lives in infamy. So yes, just as a quick check-in in case you forgot, Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932. He was reelected in 1936. He'll be reelected in 1940. So throughout this entire, through the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II, FDR is going to be the guy in charge of everything, and he'll be elected again in 1944. So he'll be elected in 32, 36, 40, and 44, 4 consecutive elections. By the time the next election rolls around, he will have succumbed to polio, which he battled the entire time he was president. But he'll be elected 4 times. He'll serve 14 of those 16 years before he passes away in 1946. He passes away, or 47 or something like that. But anyway, so FDR is still president of the United States. He describes Pearl Harbor, or describes December 7, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. So the calculus here by the Japanese was all wrong, but they figured, okay, if the United States is going to get involved in this thing, we can take out as much of their naval fleet as possible by bombing Pearl Harbor. That was the idea. Now, and hoping maybe if we bomb them, it will kind of scare them out of getting involved in the war. Now, that idea, scaring the United States out of getting involved in a war by, again, I'll remind you, destroying our boats, is not a smart strategy by the Japanese. There's never been a time where the United States has been scared out of doing something when somebody punches us in the face, especially when it comes to bombing our boats. So anyway, secondarily, didn't work out for them because it just so happened that most of our most important naval fleet that was stationed at Pearl Harbor was actually out running drills that day. So even though, yes, a lot of people were killed and yes, a lot of boats were sunk, we still had a bunch of our naval fleet that was untouched by the attack at Pearl Harbor. So it didn't have the impact that the Japanese hoped. And in fact, this is the moment that drags us into the war. If you're going to attack us, we're going to get involved in the war. So if the attack from the Japanese happened on December 7th, 1941, only 4 days later, the United States will declare war on Japan. December 11th, 1941. Again, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave a very famous speech in which he said, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. Congress is going to pass something called the War Powers Act in 1941, which basically gives Franklin Roosevelt unprecedented control over all aspects of the war effort. Now, the Constitution is set up so that Congress is supposed to control some aspects of the war effort, and the president's supposed to be in charge of some aspects of the war effort. But Congress is basically like, well, this is such a crisis, we're just going to kind of give it all to you. And remember, Congress has been in a habit of letting FDR kind of do whatever he wanted for quite some time because he became in president in the middle of a crisis. He said, "I'm going to need a lot of power and kind of a wide array of opportunity to do what I want to do to be able to address the Great Depression." And Congress is kind of, yes, you go for it. And he was a wildly popular president, supported by the American people. And so when another crisis comes along, Congress is kind of already in the practice of letting him do what he needs to do. So of course we declare war on Japan, and then pretty much immediately, Germany declares war on us. We declare war on Germany, and now we are officially allies with Great Britain. And so it's us and Great Britain, and soon the Soviet Union against Germany, Japan, and Italy. And there's some other kind of minor countries involved as well, but those are kind of it. Now, a key piece of what FDR wants to do with the war is frame it as a larger fight than just we're fighting against the Germans or we're fighting against Hitler. And this is very similar to what we saw the last Democratic president do during a world war. Woodrow Wilson during World War I wasn't like, okay, we're going to go get into this fight because, during World War I, it felt very much like we were getting involved in somebody else's fight. Like, why are we getting involved in this thing? This is their problem. And so what Wilson did in World War I said, this is a war to end all wars. Obviously, that's not true because we have World War II, but the hope was that by winning this war, we'll be able to create a new world order that will prevent wars from happening again, or this is a war to fight for democracy. So what Wilson was framing World War I as, in order to kind of help the American people understand why we're getting involved in this drama in Europe, is this is about bigger ideas. FDR is going to do the same thing. He has a very famous speech called the Four Freedoms speech, in which he illuminates that all men in all lands may live out their lives with a freedom from want, fear, and want. So he's kind of tying in the New Deal to World War II, and this idea that it's the government's job, and the United States is the best country with the best government to try to make this happen, that everyone worldwide should have basic freedoms, right? And the four freedoms he laid out was the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. So notice that two of those freedoms are freedoms of, and two of them are freedoms from. So when I say he's kind of tying in the New Deal here, when he says freedom from want, right? He's saying it's the government's job to make sure that people aren't wanting of anything, that they're not struggling and suffering to get by. But also we have to stand up for those other freedoms that we've always kind of stood up for as well. So he's kind of positioning himself in the United States as the great defender of freedom on a global scale, whether it comes to fighting against the Great Depression or fighting against the evils of totalitarianism and Nazism, whatever it is. This is a fight for freedom. Right? So that's where he's positioning himself as. Okay, part 2, organizing for victory. So now that we're officially in this thing, we got to get geared up for it. Now remember, in between World War I and World War II, we kind of went back to an isolationist foreign policy. I mean, we were still doing our imperialist thing, but like after we did that big buildup for World War I, we didn't kind of maintain this huge military apparatus. The idea wasn't that we would be a country that was kind of at forever war and needed this huge military apparatus to be able to fight it. Now we will see after World War II, we'll get there, but for now, after World War I, we demilitarized, right? We kind of dismantled our military industrial structure, right? That was part of what led to the wibble wobble of the 1920 economy. So now we have to build all that back up, and that building that back up, as I said kind of at the beginning of this, is what ends the Great Depression. We got to build all that military industrial kind of production back up to what it was during World War I and beyond. So military spending for World War II ends the Great Depression, period, end of sentence. And there's a whole bunch of details there, but military spending in World War II ends the Great Depression. The New Deal does not end the Great Depression. The New Deal helps us survive the Great Depression. It is the military spending in World War II that ends the Great Depression. If you take a look at the chart on the right, you can see as a percentage of our GDP. And remember, GDP, gross domestic product, is the total amount of money that's spent in a country in a year. Includes every dollar and cent that's spent by every citizen and the government and businesses, right? So what percentage of our GDP is the government spending on military? Well, you could see throughout, other than World War One, throughout the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, it was about 1 or 2% of our whole GDP was the government spending money on the military, right? And then in 1940s, it's like 36 or 37%, right? That means 34 cents out of every dollar that is spent by every single person and every single business and the government in the United States is spent just on military. I mean, that is an insane figure. It is mind-bogglingly insane to consider that $34 out of every $100, however you want to break this thing down, $37 out of every $100 that is spent on everything. All homes bought, all shoes bought, all cars bought, all food bought, all everything bought by everybody everywhere in the United States, including people, business, and government. That 37 out of every $100 spent was just spent on the military by the government. I mean, that is insane. And of course, it's going to get us out of a Great Depression. It's a monumental amount of spending. And then, of course, we see it drop and goes. Right. Okay. So what leads to this? Well, the Revenue Act of 1942. This is going to increase the number of people paying income tax from 3.9 million to 42.6 million. So that's where the government's going to get this money to spend, right? So we've introduced an income tax about 30 years earlier, right? We had an amendment during the Progressive era that introduced income tax. But at first, it was only for the super rich that had to pay an income tax. Most people did not pay an income tax. Well, now we're going to vastly increase the number of Americans who have to pay an income tax. Still not the poor necessarily, but a lot more people have to do it. That's going to bring a lot of money in order to pay for this war. That still only cover about half. That's still only cover about half of the cost of the war. So taxes on income and business profit will pay for half of the war. The other half is going to be borrowed. We're going to borrow money. So it's going to bring in a significant amount of debt. Between 1940 and 1945, American GDP will double. Again, a lot of that is military spending. American business profits will double. There we go. That's the key, right? American business profits will double. That's the circular flow. That's businesses growing. That's people having jobs. That's people spending money. That's what's going to get us out of the Great Depression. But also, there's going to be 3.8 million people employed by the government. We've already seen kind of this mass expansion of government employment through some of those New Deal programs, but also this way more than the New Deal. Like the amount of spending that the government's doing for the war, it dwarfs the New Deal, right? Now, it also should be noted that there's a lot of people who are like, oh my God, the New Deal is socialism. Oh my God, you're spending too much money. You're turning this to a socialist country. No one really says that when it comes to military spending. So it's always this interesting delineation when, okay, if you're spending money on trying to help people have jobs and stay in their home and eat and feed their family, it's socialism. But if you're paying for, guns and bombs and tanks and boats to defeat Hitler, which is also a worthy cause, it's not socialism. It's kind of a weird dynamic. The point being that under the World War II, we see not just a whole bunch more government spending, but a huge expansion of government employment. And those, again, we had the Public Works Administration, the CCC, various other programs during the New Deal that were government employment programs. Well, there's no government program like the expansion of the military during World War II. And it's not just the military, it's a variety of other government jobs, but most of which are focused on the war effort. So all of that basically lends itself to the end of the Great Depression and the American economy bouncing back in a major way. And we're going to see the American economy be wildly successful during and after World War II, but monumental amount of money is going to be spent on this war effort. All right, so let's take a look at what that looks like a little bit. So the War Production Board persuaded businesses to convert to military production by offering economic incentives. So remember, at the end of World War I, a whole bunch of businesses had to kind of retool themselves because they were like, okay, we were making bombs and guns and stuff, but now nobody wants those. So we have to retool ourselves to make like household goods and consumer goods and stuff like that. Well, now the government's like, no, now we need you to go back to making stuff that we need for the war. And the government, again, gave economic incentive to businesses to do that. So during the war, American manufacturers produced 86,000 tanks, almost 300,000 airplanes, more than 15 million rifles and machine guns, 64,000 landing crafts, 6,500 cargo ships. In other words, we just built the tools of war, and tons and tons and tons of them. And by the way, as a side note, a lot of that was done right here in the Bay Area over in Richmond. Tons of World War II production was done in Richmond and the Bay Area. If you look at the population of the Bay Area before the war and look at the population of the Bay Area after the war, there's a huge spike in population here because there's a ton of jobs and a ton of people moved here. And you can imagine, especially during a Great Depression, this is a great opportunity for people to get work. So all of that represents jobs. All of those jobs get people money. All those people spend money, and that then has a ripple effect to the rest of the economy. And we are fully out of the Great Depression as we build for war. All right, that brings us to part 3, life on the home front. So the question here is kind of, there are going to be, we looked at this a little bit, I think, with World War I as well. We'll look at it in more detail now. Kind of the question being, how does the war impact various groups of Americans who are those who are traditionally kind of have been oppressed, or those who have been kind of left to the side? Does this create new opportunities for people? Does it create new challenges for people? So we'll look at 4 different groups. And some of them will have new opportunities, some of them will have new challenges, and some of them will have both. So let's start with women. Lots of new opportunities for women during World War II. Now, this should not come as a surprise. I have said 117 times during the school year, maybe more than that. Anytime you see this huge expansion of industrialization, which we do during World War II, that's what part 2 was all about, right? That massive expansion. That's always going to lead to more women going into the public sphere. A lot of the jobs that were created during World War II are going to go to women, in large part because, one, as we saw with World War I, there's such an expansion. There's going to be so much demand for labor that there's just enough opportunities for women to take advantage of. But 2, a lot of young men will be going off to Europe to fight the war, and will leave even more jobs opening up, right? So you can see this poster here that they had during the war: join us in a victory job. The very famous Rosie the Riveter flexing her muscle saying we can do it. There are women who are going into secretarial jobs, of course, as they always have before, but there are also women going into, like, we're the ones building the boats, we're the ones building the guns, we're the ones doing that, right? This idea that women are actually the engines of the war effort, as they are, a lot of them are ones who are going to actually do the labor. So we see 6 million women took up jobs outside the home during World War II. Half of those women had never worked for wages before. So 3 million of those women are going into the workplace for the first time. This is a huge influx of women into the workplace, just as we saw in World War I, just as we saw in other moments of industrial expansion throughout American history. Women make up a little bit more than 1/3 of the labor force in 1945, right? So this is shifting demographics. This is a new reality in America, right? We're on our way to getting to a society in which half of the people who work are men and half of the people who work are women. We're not there yet. We're still a few decades away, but we're moving in that direction. However, we are still in a place where it is assumed the main breadwinner, the person who financially takes care of the family, is the man, is the dad, is the husband, whatever. And that's a way to justify paying women less money. Well, this is a secondary income for your family, right? So men get paid $22 a day, women get paid $7 a day for doing the same work. So there's this huge pay gap during this time period. Even though it's becoming more and more common women to go into the workplace, women are still not seen as the main breadwinner. So it's interesting that that's the way of looking at it. It's like, a person A and person B are both doing the same job. Theoretically, you'd assume that both those people should get paid the same amount of money because they're doing the same amount of work and labor. But there's still this old, persistent kind of cult of domesticity that's affecting it. Yes, women are working now, but we know you're not like the main income, right? So we don't have to pay you that much. You're just kind of getting a little bit of extra salary. In addition to women going to work in the workplace, we see a lot of women join the military, not in combat roles, but in all kinds of other support roles: nurses, secretaries, all kinds of code breaking, all kinds of stuff like that. But by and large, you could say that World War I led to mostly just new opportunities. Of course, we see the difference in pay. Of course, there's going to be discrimination and things like that, but overall, overwhelmingly, new opportunities for women come about during World War II to go into the workplace and go into the public sphere. And that always leads to more women involvement in just kind of public life in general. So World War II was good for women in America. By and large, you could say that, right? How about African Americans? Well, African Americans are going to be a little bit more complicated. So during World War I, we saw the beginning of the Great Migration. World War II, we'll see a continuation of that. Yet again, we see all kinds of jobs and new opportunities for African Americans throughout the United States, just like we saw for women on the last slide, just like we saw for African Americans in World War I. Tons of jobs to work in factories. So again, a whole bunch of African Americans finally say, this is our time to leave the South. Like, we got to get out. Like, our, we saw a bunch of our family and a bunch of our friends, a bunch of our community leave 20 years ago during World War I, and we didn't take advantage of it. Well, we got to get out of here now because we're still under Jim Crow. We're still under this horrific kind of Southern white supremacist system with the black codes and all these other things. So let's move to the north, let's move to the west, let's go someplace where we can get out of the agricultural industry and into the industrial. I'll go work in factories. So again, this Great Migration we saw in World War I, we see a continuation of that in World War II. But just like in World War I, the reaction against African Americans moving to these cities was pretty intense and pretty violent. Cities throughout the United States in the north and in the west are not happy about African Americans moving there because people are just as racist in those places as they are in the South, right? But so you see race riots break out across the United States in the 1940s, just like we saw in the 1920s. We see people putting up large signs that say, we want white tenants in our white community, et cetera, et cetera. However, there was an executive order passed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is one of the reasons why Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes a hero. That might be a strong word, but becomes someone who has a high approval rate in the African American community and is able to pull African Americans away from the Republican Party towards the Democratic Party. It's Executive Order 8802, prohibited discrimination in defense industry or government jobs. In other words, they said, look, if you're hiring for any job in the defense industry or any job in government, you cannot say, oh, we're not going to hire you because you're black. You have to have equal opportunity for whites and blacks and everybody else. And so this is a huge benefit and created opportunities for all these other jobs. On a larger scale, we also see thousands of African Americans go to fight in the war. But the kind of language that's going to be used is going to lean back into FDR's framing of the war as basically a war for freedom, a war for democracy, right? That if America is the single greatest force in the world fighting for democracy and fighting for freedom, then the question becomes, okay, cool. So we're going to go over to Europe to make sure we're defending the rights of Jewish people and other people who are being discriminated. If we're going to go and fight for freedom instead of authoritarianism, let's really do a self-reflection about what freedom looks like here. Because we can talk all day long about how horribly the Jews are being treated in Germany, but maybe we shouldn't ignore how Black people are being treated in the United States. Now, let's be clear that the level of atrocity that the Jews were experiencing, that Jewish people were experiencing in Germany with the Holocaust, obviously was horrific. But most of that wasn't really even known to the general public until the end of the war. So throughout most of the war, what we see, what the American people see as the way that the Germans are treating the Jewish people is not that dissimilar to the way that Black people are being treated in the United States, right? So for us to be indignant and to be, insulted and offended by the way that the German government is this authoritarian regime that's stripping people their rights away from them, a lot of Black people in America are like, yeah, and like, what about here, right? And so if we're going to be this force for good, this force for democracy, this force for freedom, it ultimately becomes this question that is so eloquently put forth by W.E.B. Du Bois, who we've talked about a few times here. He said, this war is about freedom. Whose freedom? Right? Whose freedom are we talking about here? And so what's developed is something called the Double V campaign, or the Double Victory campaign among the African American community that says, yeah, we'll do what we need to do to put on uniform and grab a gun and go overseas to fight for democracy, and we'll do everything we can to go into a factory and build the tools of war that we need to do that. But if we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for freedom over there, and we're fighting for freedom here. And what we will see in the subsequent chapter is that World War II really is going to be the seed that grows into the civil rights movement of the 1940s and 1950s. It's going to be people saying, okay, cool. So we're talking about freedom. We're talking about us being the United States being the single greatest engine and force for freedom and peace and democracy in the world. So let's really live up to those standards. So what does World War II mean for African Americans? It is new opportunities, of course, yes, in the factories. It's also new levels of discrimination, as we saw with race riots and efforts to segregate in northern cities. It's also new opportunities, though, again, with those jobs that were created and official government policy that says you cannot discriminate in hiring if it's a government job. But also this broader question of let's start having this conversation about what freedom really means, all right? Similar experience for Mexicans and other Latino Americans or Latinos. In the same way, there's going to be this huge increase in demand for industrial goods. It's going to lead to jobs in cities throughout the United States. It's going to lead to opportunities for women and lead to opportunities for African Americans. There's also going to be a huge increase in demand for agricultural goods, just like we saw in World War I. And so there'll be a program created called the Bracero program that invites 125,000 Mexicans to the United States from Mexico. We invite them in to the United States because we need more laborers. And one of the biggest problems, which we'll get to in the next slide, is most of the laborers in California prior to World War II, most of the agricultural laborers actually weren't Mexican and weren't Latino. Most of the agricultural laborers in California prior to World War II were Asian, specifically Japanese. That's going to be a problem, as we'll see on the next slide. So we are going to not only is there an increase in demand for labor in general, but also the laborers that had been working in those areas are no longer going to be available for reasons that you'll see in a moment that you probably may already have figured out. So this invitation to 125,000 Latinos to come to the United States, well, similar experience when a whole bunch of cities that didn't have a huge African-American population all of a sudden had tens of thousands of African Americans showing up, living there, working there. We see race riots break out. Well, in the southwestern part of the United States, places like LA and cities in Arizona and New Mexico, places like that, Los Angeles, San Diego, we'll see a pretty significant spike in the population of Mexicans and other Latinos in those areas. And the white people of those areas will not be pleased about that, right? And so we'll see, similar to we want white tenants in our white community, we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. We don't want you to come into these businesses. We don't want you to come here. And we see race riots break out in the southwestern part of the United States as well between whites and Mexicans and Latinos. So the most famous was the Zoot Suit riot, which took place in Los Angeles, called the Zoot Suit riot because the traditional kind of like, you can see that dude there with a big brim hat and high-waisted white pants. That was kind of the traditional like going out to the clubs gear for Mexicans at the time. So a fight broke out, basically a bar brawl broke out between a bunch of white naval officers and a bunch of Mexicans at a club, which then spilled into the streets and became an overall riot. And this is yet again one of many race riots at the time, but it was the one that was the most kind of significant as far as numbers and impact and stuff. And so it was called the Zoot Suit riot because of the clothing that was being worn by the Mexicans and the Latinos during this time period. It should be noted, we will, in a chapter coming up, talk about a Supreme Court case called Brown v. Board of Education, in which we're looking at the segregation of schools in the American South between whites and blacks. There's a court case that came before that in California that was about school segregation between whites and Mexicans. So we had segregated schools in California too. We didn't have a whole lot of black people before World War II. So prior to World War II, there's a lot of discrimination against Asians. There's a lot of discrimination against Latinos. So this is the reality of kind of California history, but also kind of the Southwestern history of the United States in general. So similar to African Americans, Mexicans and other Latino immigrants are going to have new opportunities in that there are going to be jobs. There's going to be more jobs, opportunities for people to immigrate here during World War II. But the level of discrimination and the level of violence and racial violence that will be enacted upon them, similar again to what we see for African Americans. Finally, of course, can't talk about World War II without talking about Japanese Americans. So there's a growing distrust of Japanese as a result of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And as a result, there's this push by people, particularly on the West Coast, particularly in California, for the government to create something called Japanese internment. So Executive Order 9066, created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, will approve Japanese internment, which basically means that they rounded up 110,000 Japanese citizens and forced them into camps during World War II, not knowing whether or not these people were spies or traitors or whatever, right? Now, it should be noted that 2/3 of those 110,000 are American born. People who were born in the United States, they immigrate here 5 years earlier, and we can question where their loyalty is. Well, they've lived most of their life in Japan and now they're here, or they moved here recently, whatever. These people were born and raised in the United States. Many of these people don't speak Japanese. Many of these people have never been to Japan. They're American citizens who have lived here their whole lives. And they're going to get rounded up and put into prison camps. Now, again, I'll remind you, at this time, we did not know the full extent of what the Nazis were doing to the Jews, right? We didn't know what the end result was. We didn't know what the final solution was. We didn't know about the Holocaust fully yet. But we did know that Jews were being rounded up and sent off to prison camps. And again, that was insulting to us. That enraged us. That gave us a sense that we were doing the right thing in the war because we were fighting against someone who had employed those types of injustices. But at the same time, we're doing the exact same thing to the Japanese. To put it another way, FDR is going on and on and on about this being a war for freedom, right? And now we already had this conversation among African Americans say, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about freedom. Let's clarify that. But how could you say that you're fighting a war for freedom when you're rounding up 110,000 people for no reason? Not because there was a tip that they may be a spy or they may not be loyal to the United States or something like that, just because of their, not even their country of origin potentially, but the country of origin for their ancestors potentially, for most of them, right? So it's this crazy reality. And really, most people would say, you know, a lot of people put FDR as one of the best presidents we've ever had. I mean, it's pretty hard not to when you think about the levels of crisis that he had to deal with and how he guided us through all that. Elected 4 times, monumentally popular, fundamentally changed American politics in a variety of ways, reshaped with the American government, people's view of the American government. But this is a huge blemish on his record and a huge blemish on the record of the United States. I mean, to justify doing this when we are, so on the one hand, we're justifying ourselves, we're claiming ourselves to be the fighters for freedom and fighting against this totalitarian regime that's rounding up Jews and throwing them in prison camps. And we're doing the exact same thing while we claim to be the ones fighting for democracy. That question on the bottom right is one that really, or the picture on the bottom right is the one that really kind of like makes my skin crawl. Every day they had all of the children of the Japanese in the internment camps start school by doing a pledge of allegiance to the flag. And, you know, we talked at the beginning of the school year about patriotism and how there's what I think is what a lot of people, what I call paper thin patriotism, where people are more interested in flags and colors than they are in how they actually treat other Americans. And so this idea of forcing people who you have imprisoned, you've removed them from their house, you've taken them away from their businesses, you've rounded them up and threw them in prison and forcing them to pledge their allegiance to a flag of a country that has imprisoned them for no reason because they've committed no crime. It's insane, right? And again, this is an ancient history. In my wife's first real job, like not like, you know, like as an adult, her boss was born in an internment camp. Like, this is not old stuff. Like, this is like people who are alive today were in these internment camps, right? Many Japanese people lose their businesses, lose their homes, because once they left, their homes basically became empty and other people started squatting in them and the government gave them rights, stuff like that. And yet again, you can see, as we've seen on the 2 previous slides, we want white tenants in our white community. We serve whites only. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. So you could definitely see these types of kind of racist themes being very true across the board in the United States, again, at a time in which we are claiming to be a country that is fighting for democracy now and freedom. The point is, it's complicated, right? Like history is complicated. I'm not saying, oh my God, we were terrible. We were just as bad as the Nazis. Don't get me wrong on that. Obviously, we weren't. We were the good guys in World War II. They were the bad guys. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't complicated. That doesn't mean that we didn't do things during the war that we could also have some self-reflection of, be ashamed of, and learn from, right? This idea of rounding people up because they seem like they're a threat. Again, this isn't ancient history. One, because as I said, my wife's boss, not now, but when she was in her 20s, was born in an internment camp, right? So it's not ancient history, but also two, there are other programs similar to this program that we've seen. After 9/11, the attack on 9/11, they created something called the Patriot Act, which basically gave the FBI and other kind of like secretive organizations full reign to just kind of arrest anybody that they thought might be a terrorist. And so all of a sudden you start seeing anybody who's, from a specific country, who dresses a certain way, who worships a certain way, start to get rounded up by the FBI without really any due process. And so these types of things can happen. I mean, it's scary when you start to scapegoat specific groups of people in a way, and the rest of the country kind of just goes along with it. It's something we have to constantly be vigilant of, because it's something that can happen, has happened, and can happen, not just in hundreds of years ago history, not even 60, 70 years ago history, but in the last 20 years history, right? So anyway, so going back through this part, women, basically new opportunities because of the new jobs. As always, an industrial boom, new jobs for women, new opportunities. African Americans, new opportunities, yet new discriminations, and an opportunity to talk about what does freedom really mean when we're talking about fighting for freedom. Latinos and Mexican Americans, similar to African Americans, but more with agricultural jobs and with industrial jobs. New opportunities, but yet new discrimination. For Japanese, it's really just straight kind of discrimination and a huge violation of their civil rights. That brings us to part 4, where we get to fighting and winning the war. Now, this is the part I said at the very beginning. We don't really get into the details of the war too much, but we'll give a general overview, and this mostly should be a reminder of what you learned about last year. Hopefully you learned about in a lot more detail than what I'm about to give you, because this is going to be quite brief and quite generic. All right. So basically, it's the Allies versus the Axis, right? And the Allies are the Soviet Union, which is represented by Stalin all the way over there on the left, the United States, represented by FDR in the middle, and Great Britain, represented by Churchill on the right. So it's USSR, United States, and Great Britain. Now, the United States and Great Britain are natural allies. We are not natural allies with the USSR. We do not like the USSR. However, this is a big time, the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. And so since Hitler invaded the USSR and the United States and is bombing Great Britain, and the United States has now gotten involved on the side of Great Britain, we all say, okay, we don't really like each other, but we got to work together to make this thing happen. So these are the big 3 allies, and they come up with a strategy together that they think is going to be the one that will be effective. Mostly it's Stalin being like, you guys got to help me out, because it's just the Nazis and Hitler and the Germans just pounding and pounding and pounding away at the Soviet Union. And even though they don't get far, and even though they don't accomplish much, I mean, the casualty level for the USSR during the war is mind-boggling. I don't think I have it anywhere in here, but if you care to look it up, or if you remember from last year, I mean, it's insane the number of people who died in World War II from the USSR defending against the German invasion. And he's like, dude, I need some relief, man. Like, I need you guys to help me out. So here's the basic deal. You see, the Germans are trying to push further into Russia over here on the eastern part of the United States, I mean, the eastern part of Europe over here. And this is basically it. Like, Hitler's base, you can see all this. Let me take a step back. All the red areas are areas that are now basically occupied by the Nazis. And you can see various other countries which are other allies or are neutral or whatever. But Spain is kind of doing its thing over here. They have their own dictator. Italy has Mussolini, which is allied with Germany. Some of these countries up here are staying neutral, whatever. So it's really just England that's holding out over here. And so Hitler and the Nazis have been able to kind of focus their full attention on just pounding away at Russia. So this is why Stalin is like, yeah, you guys need to like open up another front. You guys need to get something going on over in the West so that so that Hitler has to kind of divide his resources. So that's exactly what happens. The whole plan is to open up another front. And there's really kind of two approaches to that. One is the soft underbelly. Coming in through Italy, a lot of people think is the easy way to get in. It turns out to be true. So a lot of the allies, Americans, Canadians, Brits, whatever, come through Northern Africa into Italy. Italy folds like a house of cards, and they're moving in on, they take over Italy and they're moving in on Germany this way. Obviously, one of the most famous stories of World War II is the attack on the beaches of Normandy, which is called D-Day, the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, in which it was just I don't even know the number, but just a ton of troops, Americans, Canadians, British, storming the beaches, and just German soldiers just mowing them down. I mean, if you guys have not seen Saving Private Ryan, it's a phenomenal movie, but the first like half hour of that movie is just like grotesque, and it just shows it's just D-Day. It's just like, I don't even know, I think it's like 30 minutes of just absolute kind of horrifying. I mean, it's intense. But anyway, so the attack on D-Day, which, or the attack on France, which is now controlled by the Nazis, on D-Day at the beaches of Normandy. And then this attack will open up a Western attack. And now the Nazis and the Germans are going to have to remove some of their resources and troops over here to defend against an attack coming to Germany. So now that they've divided their resources, they can't really successfully defend against the Soviets, which are going to kind of push them back, and nor successfully defend against the British, the Canadians, and the Americans, which are going to push back. And you kind of see this closing in where the Russians are coming in from the east, the Americans, Germans, and Canadians, the Americans, British, and Canadians are moving in from the west. And soon enough, Berlin's going to kind of get pinched. Hitler will do what all brave and honorable men do when they've lost. He'll kill himself, and Germany will fold. So it is the opening of the Western piece of the European war here that will allow the Russians to finally make some progress, because the Germans will have to spread themselves too thin here. And again, Hitler didn't have to invade Russia. If Hitler had never invaded Russia, Russia probably never would have got involved. They wouldn't have wanted to have any interest in this. And it could have turned out very differently. I mean, imagine if Germany could have focused its full force and resources on just defending against the invasion from the Americans, the British, and the Canadians, and they didn't have to worry about Russia. This whole thing could have turned out very differently. But Hitler, as I said before, is a big dummy and decided to invade Russia, even though they had a peace pact, a neutrality pact. Anyway, so that leads to what is called VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, which is on May 8th, 1945, which is very exciting. All those people look very happy. America, once again, is seen as the heroes of Europe, as it was during World War I. And the relationship between America and Western Europe is going to be a very, very, very strong one, which remains all the way until today. So that's exciting. But that's only half the war. Don't forget about what's going on over in the Pacific. So we know that this red line represents kind of the extent of the area that Japan has captured. And a lot of this happened kind of before the United States even got in the war. And this is why the Japanese decided to attack Pearl Harbor, hoping that they would be able to extend their control and really fortify their control of this area, while the United States had to rebuild a lot of its naval fleet. But remember, they didn't actually successfully deplete that much of the American naval fleet. The Battle of Midway, which is right here, an island called Midway because it's midway through the Pacific Ocean between North America and Asia, is a huge, huge battle. It's a victory for the United States over the Japanese, and it really gave the United States kind of a jumping off point so that our supply lines didn't have to be too long coming over from Hawaii, et cetera, et cetera. And the strategy that's going to be employed by the United States is going to be known as island hopping rather than going straight after Japan. We're going to kind of slowly go through and take over as many of these smaller, seemingly less significant islands as possible. And then that will allow us to disrupt their supply lines and eventually kind of close in on Japan. So slowly but surely, we kind of make our way island by island, going through a lot of these smaller little islands that nobody's ever heard of before, kind of collapsing down on the extent to which Japan had expanded its control. Oh yeah, here, I have a whole slide on island hopping. So here you go. This is what you should have been looking at while I was talking about island hopping. Boop, 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 hop, 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 island, island, island. There you go. You get the idea. All right. So as I said before, just kind of slowly but surely through 1943, 1944, just moving through, taking over all of these things, eventually kind of removing the Japanese influence for all these places. So now we could just focus kind of exclusively on Japan. As of course you know, ultimately the decision is made to drop a couple of horrifyingly disturbing, devastating weapons on Japan. And this is one of the kind of great moral questions of American history. So let's actually take a step back real quick. Remember that FDR is going to succumb to polio, I think in 1940. So I guess it'll be in 45. So he won in 32, he won in 36, he won in 40, he won in 44, and then he'll die in 1945. His vice president, Harry Truman, will become president of the United States. And the whole time during World War II, these weapons, these atomic bombs had been kind of being developed in secret, so secret that the vice president himself didn't even know about them. So when he became president in the middle of World War II, they were like, hey, congratulations, you're president. By the way, we have these horrifyingly destructive weapons. Do you want to drop them on Japan? So he learned about these brand new weapons in this project that had been going on and was faced with the decision about whether or not he wanted to use them pretty much right when he became president. And the final decision was that if we invade Japan and have a land war, it'll probably lead to more death and destruction than if we drop a couple of these bombs. Now, that is, again, one of the great moral questions of American history. It's been debated by a lot of different people. Should we have dropped the bomb? Should we have done a land war? There are other things we could have done. I haven't studied the subject enough to have an opinion formed. Not that you were waiting to hear what I had to think about it, but just anyway. But those two bombs were dropped in total on two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In total, it killed 110,000 Japanese people. Pretty much all of them were citizens, not military personnel. So it's another piece of the kind of moral question here. But this led to kind of a horrifying reality, not just for the moment, but kind of for the history of the world, that we had kind of entered into a new age of weapons, a new age of destruction. And a lot of people also make the argument that these bombs were dropped in part by Truman seeing that that we were getting to the end of World War II, and post World War II world really looked like the United States and the Soviet Union were going to start to tangle with who was going to be a global superpower, and that the United States wanted to show off that they had this to the Soviets, to kind of be like, don't mess with us, like we have this, which is, again, not necessarily, I don't think, a good enough reason to drop these bombs and kill that many people. But the devastation of these bombs is monumental and was felt for decades to come, because even the kind of the radiation and things like that had seeped into the soil and the water sources were still causing all kinds of health problems and giving people diseases and stuff all the way until like the 1980s and 1990s. But point being, after the dropping of these bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan was like, okay, yeah, we don't want to do this. So they surrendered, and that led to VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, September 2nd, 1945. So it is now 1945. The United States finds itself in familiar territory as it did in 1919. We helped win a war. We helped save Europe and helped save the world. And it was a war that we did not want to get involved in, but we got dragged into. From a global perspective, we are seen as the heroes of the world once again. And we are in a position to really try to shape the post-war global community. We tried to do that after World War I, and obviously we fell short. Many of the efforts of post-World War I was to try to avoid something like that ever happening again. Obviously, something like that did happen again. So now we're going to try to do the same thing after World War II. So next unit, because this is the last chapter of Unit 7, the next unit we're going to get into what kind of post World War II looks like from a domestic perspective and from an international perspective. We are now not just one of the global powers, but really kind of the global superpower. So we'll get into that later on. But of course, we also have to acknowledge the impact on the home front. This war got us out of World War II. I mean, sorry, that didn't make any sense. This war got us out of the Great Depression, the massive amount of spending, this huge military ramp up, which we will also see in coming chapters, is not going to go back down. After World War I, we kind of dismantled our kind of military industrial, production levels. That's not going to happen after World War II. We're going to stay this huge military power. We're going to stay producing at that level. So that's going to have an impact on our economy. It's going to have an impact on us globally. But we also saw some conversations start to get started during World War II with more and more women going to the workplace. And we've always seen when more women go into the workplace, that leads to more other big pushes towards more women in the public sphere, whether it's in work, in government, in reform movements. We also saw this conversation about what does freedom mean, the double V, victory at home and victory abroad for the African American community. So World War II is a huge turning point for the United States. It solidifies us as a global superpower, militarily, diplomatically, economically, and we will see soon culturally. But it's also shaking some stuff up domestically that's going to lead to some pretty significant changes in the 1950s and 1960s as well. Okay, that's it. That is chapter 24. That is World War II. Thanks for listening. You guys are fantastic. I'll see you next time.